Welcome everybody to part 2 of our course on Christian Realism, taught by our resident scholar, Mark Levecki. I am the other Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy and editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American Foreign Policy, which is the host of this event. We're grateful for all of you who are here physically to partake in dinner of kebab, etc., as well as those who are watching online live and those who will be watching this later as we post this presentation onto YouTube and elsewhere. We want to explain the principles of Christian realism, and we believe that we are the only organized specific voice for Christian realism in Washington, D.C. So this is a lot of responsibility, and we appreciate your support in this project. Mark Levecki will speak for how long this time, Mark?
Briefly. And then you do all of it.
More briefly than last Monday night, so there'll be more time for questions and comments and exchanges. So Mark Levecki, thank you for part 2.
So there... Excuse me. Oh. All right. Do this to keep me honest. Thank you for coming back. For those of you who came back, welcome to those of you who are here for the first time. So yeah, the plan, there was a miscommunication last time on my part, not Colin's part, but I thought I had more time than I should have had. So I indulged myself and just kept talking. So today's going to be a little briefer for a couple reasons. One, if you're here for Eric Patterson, I apparently have the hard duty of telling you that Eric Patterson has been detained, not by the police or anybody, but by an opportunity that he had to take up, and so he is not going to be here. But I will try to channel his spirit. So if you're here for Eric Patterson, I could pretend awkwardly to tie my shoe or adjust my fly or something, and you could slip out. But if you're happy to stay, then please stay. My plan is this. So last week, I hope everybody either was here or has seen it or heard tell of it, but I illuminated 5 principles of Christian realism, right? I tried to walk us through creation, fall, restoration, responsibility, and then parenthetically, American power and responsibility. And then the 5th being church and future hope, right? I want to say a little bit more about power, just sort of a brief prelude to the evening. And then I want to spend the bulk of our time having an interactive lesson, running you through a set of scenarios that we use at the U.S. Naval the U.S. Naval Academy, as we walk through what we call a moral deliberation roadmap. And I'll say more about that when we get to it. But it's going to be a little bit of an introduction by me and then an awful lot of interaction by you guys. And so, George, I don't know how this can play out, but if you guys just shout your answers, we don't have to worry about the mic, at least during the brief exchange. And then we'll do a conclusion, open it up to questions and answers, etc. What I want to start with, though, is if you were here or if you listened to it, and if there are lingering questions from last time, because I think I gave a little bit of a fire hose last time, and if there are remaining questions or comments or concerns, etc., now's a great time to ask them. So, are there any lingering questions from last time? Nothing you've been stewing on for a week, just chewing on and wondering where it all fits in? All right. I'll not pretend that it's because I was so good there are no questions anymore, but then I'll jump into it. So a brief word about American power. So this sort of fits under point 4 on responsibility, right? And I had talked about, you'll recall, I hope, toward the end, I talked about American Westerns and American support for, but apprehension or concern about the use of force, right? I called it violence last week. And I gestured to the idea that in a typical Western, there's a civilization that is struggling to come out of the wilderness, right? So you think of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. There's literally a wilderness scenario in which the town of Shinbone is struggling to emerge into out of being purely a territory and into statehood. But the territory is ruled de facto by a man named Liberty Valance, who's a gunslinging outlaw. And into this society comes Stoddard Ransom, played by Jimmy Stewart, who wants to bring law. That's to say, he wants to bring civilization, right? All the accoutrements necessary for civilization to flourish. But before he can get to Shinbone, he's waylaid by Liberty Valance, who leaves him beaten on the side of the road. He leaves. John Wayne enters the scene, and just like the Good Samaritan, picks up Ransom off the side of the road, puts him in his cart, takes him to an inn, pays the innkeepers to heal Ransom. So again, this is a continuation of the Good Samaritan story. And then he finds out later that Ransom is insistent on opening up a law practice, and he says things like, well, if you're going to hang that law shingle, right, the advertisement for your law firm, if you're going to hang that shingle, you'd better have a gun to back it up. Again, stressing that before you can bring something like justice and peace and all the things necessary for civilization to flourish, you have to have order. And before you can have order, you probably are going to need dangerous men in this context to bring about that order. And then the rest of the movie, I argue, is sort of a what if of the Good Samaritan. What if, instead of just one guy waylaid on the side of the road, what was really going on was a continuing systemic problem with violence and anarchy that wasn't allowing civilization to flourish. What do good people do then? And I think The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is John Ford's answer to that. But at the end of Liberty Valance, there's no place for the man who brings order and therefore the conditions necessary for civilization to take root. And I argue that this is endemic throughout American Westerns. If you think about the movie Shane, Once Upon a Time in the West, there's anarchy or there's lawlessness. Incarnate into this arena of lawlessness comes the gunslinger, the man of violence. They bring about the conditions necessary for order, usually by killing all the bad guys, and then they are essentially run out of town. And usually it's done, or sometimes it's done in a romantic sort of way. They ride off into the sunset. But sometimes they ride off into the sunset questionably wounded, maybe to a mortal degree, as in Shane. Definitely dead, as in Once Upon a Time in the West, when one of the two who brings the conditions for order is slung dead over the horse as the other one rides off into the sunset. Meanwhile, behind, civilization begins to flourish, but they have no part in it. And my argument is that America understands the need for force, but we're really uncomfortable with it at heart. And that manifests in things like saying, if you read war memoirs, you'll see very often some form of the phrase, killing is wrong, almost full stop, but I know that in war it is necessary. And I've argued, I think I touched on this last week, that Christian realists like Reinhold Niebuhr take this vein, where they say, look, there's the law of love, which is the premier law for Christians. That's, if you follow Jesus, it's the law of love, which doesn't just dictate nonviolence, it dictates non-resistance to evil. Non-resistance, right? No resistance whatsoever. But he recognizes that that law of love, as he calls it, is impractical in this world in which there are rapacious beasts who want to eat their neighbors. And so he advocates for a second law, which is the law of responsibility. And these two laws, the law of love and the law of responsibility, clash. And it's very awkward. But if we only pursue the law of love, we're not going to get any love because of our rapacious neighbors. And we're not, therefore, going to get any responsibility. We're not going to rescue the innocent, punish the guilty, restore injustices, anything like that. So if you aim at love, you get neither love nor responsibility or justice. But if you aim at justice, Niebuhr will argue, you can get a measure of justice, and you can kind of qualify that or season it with love. So it doesn't have to be the full extent of justice. There could be mercy within justice. And so it's responsibility seasoned with love. And if you aim at that, you can get a little bit of that, and you're going to get a little bit of love. All right? The problem with this, according to Niebuhr, is that if you do this, then you've incurred moral guilt, because this process of resisting evil, remember, contradicts the law of love, and therefore it creates sin. And so Niebuhr will say things like, you cannot move responsibly throughout history without incurring guilt. So he thinks just warriors, for instance, are doing morally evil things because they must avoid things that are more greatly morally evil. All right, so there's this tension again that's there. All that to say, I think that tension with violence or force spills over generally into a discomfiture with power writ large, right? Especially, it seems, within Christian communities, where people tend to think that power is something, that is bad. At best, it's something maybe that is neutral, but it's not something maybe that Christians should seek, right? And I want to make the argument that actually power is a created good. God has power. So it's a good. And like all goods, human beings have devised really clever ways of abusing it and perverting it, twisting it, bending it all out of shape so that it manifests in overwhelming evil. Remember our rapacious neighbors, right? But I want to make a place in my fourth point about Christian realism for the responsible use of power. And I just want to, to put a finer point to it in order to set up the rest of what I want to do together through interaction. So a word about American power, and then, and this is the part that we're going to do together, some thoughts on spending power rightly, right? What does that look like? And so it begins with something like this. I've come to believe that nations, like individuals, have vocations, all right? It's mainly because I don't think nations act, right? I don't know what it would mean to say, oh, America acted. No, Americans act through the vehicles of government, through the mechanisms of government. And so people act. And because people have vocations, therefore, people who come together as nations and exercise governance have vocations, therefore nations have vocations. I talked about this briefly in point 1 when I talked about creation and what it means to exercise dominion. And that in the creation narrative, human beings are given dominion, providential care over all of creation. And so a sovereign, stemming from that, looking at places like Romans 13, you see, I think, similar language, where the sovereign is he or she or it over whom there is nobody greater charged with care of the political community. So again, this providential care or dominion for the political community. And they are responsible for bringing about the conditions necessary for and the maintenance of things like order, justice, and peace, which are political goods without which no other political good can endure, like life or education or health, things like this. So that's in brief the vocation of the sovereign, therefore the vocation of nations. Exceptional nations, so this question of American exceptionalism, does it exist? Exceptional nations, perhaps, are not actually those nations with some sort of a unique calling. I think the scriptural mandate applies to all. But maybe those nations that have over time habituated in themselves the disposition and the reputation and have gathered together power to meet its responsibility. So maybe an exceptional nation is one that has accepted the mantle of responsibility, has accumulated the power necessary to back that responsibility up, and then has gone on to use that responsibility not just for its own welfare, but when and where it's prudential to do so for the wider welfare of the world at large, all right? Wherever it's, and this is important to stress, where and when it's prudential to do so. So I would argue that while a sovereign's primary moral obligation is always going to be to its own constituency, the American president's number one obligation is the American people. So while a sovereign's primary moral obligation is to its own constituency, there's a secondary obligation to cultivate the good of the global community of nations, right? And if we're concerned about our global neighbors, then it seems for that to be effective, and if being effective isn't always what we should pursue. Sometimes being effective isn't prudential, and we can't be effective. But if this concern for the neighbor is basically to be effective, then it has to manifest also in care for our neighbor's neighborhood, for the conditions in which our neighbors find themselves. So God's attributes, to give us sort of a picture of what this might look like. God's attributes, you probably know, are helpfully divided by theologians into two sort of broad categories. Those power characteristics, on the one hand, that describe his greatness, so his omnipresence, his omniscience, his omnipotence, sort of his omni-everything. All those power characteristics are categorized under his greatness. So God has greatness. And then those moral characteristics that describe his goodness, his compassion, love, mercy, and the like, are glommed under this category of goodness. So God has greatness and God has goodness. I want to argue that in a similar way, by analogy, nations can cultivate both greatness and goodness. And some people will hear this and they'll think, well, this necessarily means that you compromise national interest. I don't think it needs to mean that. Done rightly, this cultivation of both greatness and goodness can become itself a national interest. It could be a national interest to exercise and cultivate a reputation for goodness. I think it's easy to forget this. Our political discourse nowadays, you probably noticed, tends to traffic in false binaries, right? There's realism versus idealism. There's compassion versus security. There's justice versus love, so the Niebuhrian paradox. And then it seems that as we dig into our own particular political camps, it becomes really easy to forget that these things actually ought not to be zero-sum games, right? We can be compassionate without taking anything away from our security. Maybe you risk your security a bit, that's just realistic, but maybe we can absorb those risks prudentially, and it's okay. In the very least, we can maybe find a salutary balance between striving to be compassionate to the nth degree or secure to the nth degree. Maybe it doesn't have to be an nth degree kind of game, right? We can fudge the margins here and there. This isn't to argue in any way that any person nor any nation is called to waste their lives or the lives of their people. But people, as well as nations, may be called to spend their lives. And this we know to be true. Because its primary obligation, again, is to secure the basic goods of justice, order, and peace for its own citizens, no nation, except in cases maybe of true global calamity. So there may be exceptions in the extreme to this. But by and large, no nation can be ever asked to spend itself out of existence. That would be obtuse. That would go against the very principle of being a nation to begin with. But America, I think especially, has demonstrated more often than detractors might like to admit that powerful nations can spend much in pursuit of global common good without compromising fidelity to itself or to its own internal responsibilities. I think this can be seen in the better angels of our foreign policy, in the enormous sums that we've spent on rebuilding defeated foes, in the treasure that we've spent on international aid, and of course in the lives given for the rescue of countless others. It could be seen, in dead practical tactical scenarios and operating under rules of engagement that risk force protection for the sake of non-combatants. Not every nation does that. Right, so by way of analogy, I used to live in Slovakia, and during some of the I-4 movements, and especially during the Kosovo campaign in former Yugoslavia, I had a Serbian friend who met me on the street once, and she boasted, hey, have you been watching the news? So I've been watching the news, and she says, we can defeat the American Air Force with rock concerts. And some of you might not be old enough to remember this, but I hope you are. During Kosovo, there were certain key bridges that we knew we needed to knock out in order to prevent the Serbs from being able to move men and equipment to various locations. But of course, the Serbs know that there are certain bridges we're going to want to knock out in order to prevent the Serbs from moving men and material to certain locations. So what did the Serbs do? They didn't have the military defenses to defeat our Air Force or stop us from blowing up these bridges. So Serbian civilians, poured out onto these bridges and held rock concerts. They had impromptu barbecues, and when the jets would fly over full of bombs to blow up these bridges, they would hold up signs that said, "Shoot me!" Right? What do you think the American Air Force did? We didn't shoot, right? And actually, to some degree, to some not insignificant risk to those pilots, right? I mean, I'm sure they accounted for all these things, but pilot friends of mine would say, you go out to the target laden with a certain amount of munitions, with a certain amount of fuel, expecting that you're going to dump those munitions and fly back needing another certain amount of fuel. And when you don't drop those munitions, sometimes it can get tight because you didn't account for that. Now, there's always redundancy. We're not crazy. So they're usually safe, but there's increased risk. But we didn't drop those bombs. But my Serbian friend said we could defeat the American Air Force with rock concerts. And so at a moment I think of inspired genius, I said, well, thank you for the compliment. And she went, compliment? No, we beat you with rock concerts. That's why I understand that. And so I'm thanking you for the compliment. She said, what are you talking about? I said, well, let me just ask you a question. If we were the Russians, would you have done that? She was like, hell no. Like, oh, well, why? No, they're going to blow us up. Thank you for the compliment. You know something about the character of the American regime, that rock concerts are a safe bet for you. Right? And if we were almost any other nation, you wouldn't do that because they might drop the bomb because they want the bridges dropped. Right? So thank you for the compliment. I think America has built, even in the minds of our enemy. You think of the early days in the Iraq War, or even terrorist tactics. Why do terrorists shield themselves with children? Right? Because it works against us. Right? Why did Iraqis? I can't remember there's a technical term for this that always eludes me, but they fake surrender. Right? They don't mean to surrender, but they pretend to surrender. So when we get close to take them into custody, they pick up their weapons and fire on us. Why did they do that? Because it works, right? So we have a reputation that some people don't want to admit exists for goodness. Tactically, we operate under these rules of engagement that risk force protection for the sake of non-combatants. We kick in doors rather than leveling villages entirely. You can see our basic goodness in the treatment of POWs. You can see it in the fact that we take POWs, right? On and on and on. And when we run amiss, more often than not, you can see it in how we prosecute our own for abusing those POWs, right? Are we perfect? No. But we have a reputation for basic goodness that we have cultivated and I think we have earned. Now, such moral action and moral reputation, I do not think is arbitrary. It's focused on specific ends. It's efficacious toward achieving those ends. If some of our little acts of goodness were not efficacious, there would be no point in doing them, right? Acts of goodness, acts of self-sacrifice, acts of self-risk, I think one of the things that make them legitimate is that they have a possibility of being efficacious, of working toward their goals. Some people will look at the cross and they will say, well, the model for Christians ought to be self-sacrifice. Look at that. Like Jesus didn't retaliate, even though he said he could bring battalions of angels. Like he walked into his pain and he died on the cross. And so shouldn't Christians do that? To which I respond, usually snarkily, that the cross didn't actually accomplish that much. Right? And at this point, you should be uncomfortable and all that, right? The cross at a personal level accomplished everything, of course. It reconciled us to God. But it didn't reconcile me to you. Not necessarily. Maybe it should have inspired our reconciliation. But it took care of the problem of human evil insofar as it interferes in my ability to be accepted by a holy God, right? It took care of evil, but it didn't take care of evils. It saved me from sin, my sinning, but it didn't save you from my sinning, correct? So it was efficacious for the problem it was trying to solve, but it wasn't efficacious toward other problems because it wasn't ever intended to solve those other problems, right? So when we talk about the self-sacrifice of Christ as a model, I think we have to be incredibly careful what we think it's modeling, all right? And not make analogous examples in other ways. And we could talk about what that might look like if you're interested. All right. Not only do I believe that nations, like individuals, can grow in the acquisition and the reputation for virtue, but a moral use of American power helps make our power sufferable to those nations that are underneath it. All right, and so here we begin to come to this idea of national interest. When we have a reputation for basic goodness, and we couple that with tremendous power, I think that power is more sufferable to nations that are beneath it, because they recognize that we don't have only our own interests in mind, right? So you think of the work we've done in Europe, the work we've done in NATO, et cetera. And this could be true of any nation. I'm speaking as an American right now. Getting that balance, obviously, between exercising responsibility for our own interests and for others' interests is always tricky, and getting it wrong has tremendous costs. I'll conclude this section with this, just to note that any nation that is so concerned about being good that ignores the constituent elements of what greatness requires, including the ability to protect itself, is not going to survive long in a rapacious world. So we can't be only concerned about goodness. At the same time, I submit that any nation that is so concerned about its greatness is thinking too small. Any nation that is only concerned with its ability to achieve its own interests and maintain its own security, that it ignores the goodness or the welfare of others, that it doesn't do the good that it can, that it doesn't help where it is able. Any nation that is so concerned only with its own greatness, I actually don't think as a Christian is much worthy of survival, right? Because nations have vocations, and when you shirk that vocation, I don't know what the point is anymore. All right, that's the introduction. The question now is, how do you expend power responsibly? I submit, again, that as with people, so too nations. So how do people exercise power rightly? How do people exercise power responsibly? And a part of this, and here I'm going to walk us through these scenarios that we use with the midshipmen at the Naval Academy, because I think this is maybe an experiment. Maybe you'll be like, why did we do this? But I hope you find this interesting, and I hope you find this useful. The question becomes this. Responsible power expenditure has an awful lot to do with making wise moral choices. That should be a truism. This is going to involve moral perception, the ability to discern morally relevant information in a conflict situation, right? What is morally relevant? What is not? What's incumbent upon me? What is not incumbent upon me? These kinds of questions. Moral perception is essential to moral reasoning. The ability to deliberate what is right from wrong, the ability to deliberate what is the right thing to do is essential. We teach this at the Naval Academy in part because we think that this perception can actually be trained, right? That actually people can grow in virtue, that character can be cultivated, that you're not just born with it, right? It can be trained. Moral deliberation is the reasoning out from the information that we have and the duties that we owe, what is the right thing to do? What is the right thing to do as a question, I think, begs another question. What maybe is the question that is begged? If I say to you, what is the right thing to do? What question, what unarticulated assumption is being begged there?
That there is something like right or good.
That there is a right thing to do, right? Again, this might be a truism, but it's important to grasp. If you ask the question, what is the right thing to do? You can put the emphasis on the word the. There is a right thing to do, right? Therefore, there's also a wrong thing to do, and probably many wrong things to do. But all of this, I think, begs a second question, and it's this. We ought to do what the right thing to do is, right? We actually ought to do that. So not only do we ask the question, what is the right thing to do? Not only does that admit that we think there is a right thing, but presumably and hopefully it means that we believe we ought actually to do that thing. We ought to do what is right. We ought not to do what is wrong. And a little bit more on that I'm going to deal with in the end, because I think that leads to a particular problem that our present culture faces. But for now, I want to address one piece of that, and it's a Christian concern for integrity. All right. Recall that one of the fundamental characteristics I said of Christian realism rests on the assumption that some moral narratives, some ways that we see the world, some ways that we see our role in the world, some of the things that we find significant can be wrong, right? So Christian realism suggests that there is a reality that's objective, it's not purely subjective. I don't get to decide all the terms of it, and therefore there are some ways of being in the world that are simply wrong. The Christian realist is going to demand an accurate assessment of creation, fall, restoration, responsibility, future hope. This is going to require theological integrity. Our theology has to be right, which in turn requires a Christian understanding of our own theological resources and how those resources bear on the moral life. So what can we bring forward? What are the assumptions that are tacit that we should make articulate in order to understand how we move forward in a conflicted world? Those are some of the questions that I want to kind of tease out. This will make us, as a community, as a Christian community, in all likelihood, somewhat distinctive, right? You probably noticed that when it comes to responding to the daily news, Christians or other theologically orthodox Jews or Muslims tend to have a distinctive way of looking at social problems than other people who don't believe in a God do, right? There's a distinctiveness there. One thing that I'm committed to is this idea of Christian distinctiveness is an accident of history. It's not the point, right? We shouldn't strive to be distinctive. But if we're striving for theological integrity, we're unlikely to be merely an echo of what, liberal or utilitarian ethics has to say. But the distinction or the distinctiveness is an accident. It's not the way it ought to be. We would rather not be distinctive at all. We would rather everybody think like we do, right? So it's integrity we're after. So what is integrity before we continue? What's a working definition of integrity? We use the word all the time. What's it mean?
Honest in character.
Honest in character. Okay. Yeah, good. Please.
Like remaining the same regardless of the circumstances.
Oh, nice. Okay. Good.
I'm gonna say consistency between ideals and behavior.
Yeah, nice. Okay, so I think all of that, these last two bits in particular, what did you say?
Said remaining the same regardless of the circumstances.
Remaining the same, and you use the word consistency, which is remaining the same, right? So consistency between what you say you believe and how you act, right? Is that good?
Yeah.
All right. So I think that's the definition of integrity we use at the Naval Academy. I want to challenge one piece of this, and this is a little bit, it's not semantic, it's not even snarky, but I want to push it a little bit. So if a member of the SS acted in ways consistent with his devotion, or her devotion, to blood and soil nationalism, would we be content to say that this person has integrity? You said no? But our working definition is consistency between belief and act. They believe in blood and soil nationalism, and they act consistently with that. But we don't want to say they have integrity.
I would say no. I think it's sort of their actions are undermining moral principles that they ought to follow.
That they ought to follow. Okay. So I think you can easily amend what you said, just for the point. How would you amend it?
Moral consistency between sort of ideals and action, or consistency between ideals and action that's grounded in moral precepts.
Right. So I don't know if you can hear him in the back, but basically like consistency between right belief and action, right? Between moral belief and action. That's integrity, right? So theological integrity, that's integrity. It can't just be consistency between belief and action, but between right belief and right action. When somebody's conduct and principles clash, right, they suffer what the psychologists will call cognitive dissonance, right? So I'm acting in ways that are inconsistent with my beliefs. And there are at least two ways that we can deal with cognitive dissonance. One is, we call it at the Naval Academy, the high road and the low road. You can probably guess what these are. On the one hand, we can conform our principles to our conduct. That's the low road, right? Or we can conform our conduct to our principles, right? That's the high road. So where my conduct, misaligns with my principles, I readjust. Or I write principles, I readjust. Cognitive dissonance, if the stakes are high enough, might be what is also described as moral injury. And you might have heard this talked about. A moral injury has many definitions. One of the working ones is that you've done or allowed to be done something that goes against a deeply held moral norm. And again, as I've stressed with the cowboy films, with American apprehension for power, many Americans are raised to believe, it's just picked up in the water, that killing is wrong, but in war it is necessary. So this is, the motif of the Western, right? We know that killing is wrong, so you have no place in civilized society if you're really good at killing. But we also know it's necessary, so we need somebody to do the killing, right? But if all of this is true, then the very business of warfighting becomes morally injurious, because we made warfighting a source of cognitive dissonance. Because we've said, here's your belief, killing is wrong. But we've said your responsible action has to be killing. So we baked into it a dissonance between what I say I rightly believe and what I ought to believe and what I actually do.
You have a reason for doing what you're doing. You analyze why you do it. You don't do it just for fun. You just do it.
That's for sure. Amen. There is a third way, I think, that we ought to talk about sort of resolving cognitive dissonance, and that's this idea of discovering that maybe our principles aren't right in the first place, right? So we have to adjust our principle, and therefore it becomes this tightening of conduct and right belief, and it's an adjustment or an adjustment. It's figuring out that we've gone off azimuth, right? We're off the compass point, and we just have to realign. Now back to integrity. I want to draw this together. I've said integrity has to be something more than merely consistency between belief and action, consistency between right belief and right action. The analogy that I might use, that I use at the academy, is a ship's hull, right? We talk about a ship having integrity or a hull having integrity. And in terms of engineering, I think the true sort of definition of integrity bears out a little more obviously. There are certain conditions under which a ship's hull can be called structurally sound, under which it can be said to have integrity. And those conditions, of course, aren't up for grabs, right? They're physical, they're mechanical rules. I can't describe them. It's way beyond my pay grade, but there are things that tell shipbuilders how to build a ship that's going to be seaworthy, and those shipbuilders have no choice about it, right? So I submit that the same thing is in play with the moral structure of the universe. Just as there are physical laws to which we must conform if we don't want our ships to sink, there are moral laws to which we must adhere if we are to be virtuous people, if we are to be people who can claim to have integrity. Again, as with people, so too nations. There are certain behaviors that nations have to do if those nations are to say that they have integrity. The value of a ship's hull having integrity, of course, is that it allows the ship to perform the purposes for which it was made. All right? I think the same thing is true as human beings. I think I said here, I might have said this to a different group last week, but there is a vocation to being a good human being. And being a good human being isn't entirely up for grabs, right? There's a certain moral ecology in which human beings can flourish, and absent that moral ecology, it's increasingly more difficult to flourish, right? I'll describe later, if we get to it, that I think the whole purpose for moral theology is beatitude, right? So the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are those, the Beatitudes. The beatific vision is figuring out what it is you were made for. It's an ends orientation. So in this sense, we should think about Aristotle. Aristotle talks about eudaimonia, right? Happiness or flourishing. And he acknowledged that there are certain ways that human beings can flourish, all right? The Beatitudes carry that idea forward. So there is a Christian understanding of eudaimonia. It's different than the classical one. I think arguably in the classical mind, virtue was its own reward. For the Christian, virtue is always going to be instrumental. It's going to lead us to the capacity to love God, right? That's the point of virtue. It's instrumental. But I think it's important to have that out there. Now, if all of this is true, it's helpful to have a way of thinking about moral conflict that helps us to morally deliberate with integrity, all right? And so at the Naval Academy, they developed, before I ever got there, something that they call the Moral Deliberation Roadmap. Does everybody have this? If you don't have this, in between the elevators is a stool, and there's a whole bunch of copies. So what I'm going to walk us through now is an examination of the Moral Deliberation Roadmap, and it's going to look something like this. We're going to start with a test. Are you ready to be tested? You can give me you could give me a show of hands, thumbs up or thumbs down. Thumbs up, yes. Thumbs down, no. All right. The question is this: you see someone. You're walking along the lakeside. You see someone drowning in this lake. There are no boats. There are no flotation devices immediately available. You realize that you can save them with no risk to yourself. All right? Ought you to save them? Yay?
Yeah, of course.
Yes, of course, he says. He's confident. Everybody, who? Yes? Anybody say no? Nobody thinks you ought not to save them, or it's up for grabs. Everybody thinks you ought to save them. All right. You can dissent. Don't worry. We won't think you're a complete monster. Now let's complicate this. What if you realize that there is an undertow? It's particularly strong. The water is quite choppy. And you might actually be in some real danger if you try and assist. ought you to swim out and try to get them? Who says yes? Okay. Some hands kind of, Who says not necessarily? Let's leave it for that. Okay.
Well, why are you putting limits on what we can do? Then there can be other things I can do with just swimming. Get
Oh,
other
because
people
because it's a
myself.
frustrating philosophical characteristic that we create these very limited scenarios in order to tease out larger truths. These are preposterous and ridiculous and would never happen.
Yeah, I know it's not
Of
realism
course.
because what you give
We're
us
just
all
going to
these
go with
things
it. We're
in
going to
I don't
suspend our
see the-
disbelief. Suspend your disbelief, and if you don't like it, just sit there quietly, endure it, and then at the end you can denounce it. All right? I know they're frustrating. Drives my wife crazy, but she comes up with them all the time. So you said not necessarily.
Yes.
Why not necessarily?
I think it depends on the person and what the reward is of saving that person, because that's the benefit relative to the cost and the risk.
Okay. Well, it might be a reward that would make that person think, okay, I'm gonna take the risk. I'm gonna go.
Is their life more valuable?
Okay. So the person drowning. So maybe some sort of knowledge about the person.
Right.
Okay.
I would say it comes down to the question of, is it, like, it's better for, in this scenario, it'd be better if one person died than two people died. Like, there's a very significant chance that you attempting to go save this person will result in you failing, and so your own death, along with their own, I would say that it's better to not risk your life to save them at the cost of both lives being lost.
Okay. Good. All right.
I also think the circumstances of the person doing the saving might be taken into account. Like if they're a single parent and their primary responsibility is
right.
to their children,
Okay.
then maybe risking their life is more grave than for someone who doesn't have other obligations.
Okay, so so that's good. So what other factors, and this is starting to get to the complaint, right? What other factors do we have to bring into this deliberation? So who am I, right? One of the follow-on questions later will be, you're walking with your 2-year-old son, right? There's no place to set him safely. What do you do, right? Things like this. But what are the other factors that we would take into account? One of the factors is maybe relative importance of these people, right? Maybe let's just get this off the table now. Do these two people, whoever you are and whoever the person drowning is, do those two people have equal dignity?
Of course.
Like, are they of equal value in the eyes of God?
Yeah.
Yeah, God knows.
Sure, but they might have different instrumental value to society, right? Right. So now I was going to do this later, let's just bring it up now. There's the god-awful, what my brother, who is a paramedic firefighter, calls the law of resuscitability, right? I can't often say this word in public. I'm happy I was able to get it out now. The law of resuscitability, dared to do it twice, is kind of an ugly law. But it says that you pull out of a fire or some other crisis situation people in order of their immediate importance, right? So if we go in looking for a 2-year-old child and the timbers in the burning house fall down and crush my fellow firefighter, who am I taking out first? Well, the fellow firefighter, right? Because he's just gone down. He's probably more viable than the kid who's been stuck in the fire for some time. If I can get him out and safe, maybe we can reinsert him back online and he can help out. All these things, right? In a crisis situation, an earthquake or a hurricane or something, maybe there are grievously wounded people who, under normal circumstances, you would lavish care on. But here there are some grievously wounded and there are some modestly wounded people, some of whom maybe are doctors. And if you can tend to the modestly wounded, to the loss of the significantly wounded, you're actually better off because you've got more people who are going to be savable and more people who maybe be able to get online and help you save others, right? So this is the law of resuscitability, and that has to be a factor, which should be uncomfortable, and welcome to the moral life, right?
And
So
the least injured you would have more ability to deal with
Yep.
than you would the severely injured.
So we call that, what's the word we use for that?
Practicality.
Yeah, practicality.
Utilitarianism.
What was that?
Utilitarianism.
Well, maybe, but there's a medical term. Just triage, right? There is such a thing as moral triage, right? Where you have to think about these things at a moral level as well. What other factors might go into this? Here's a real obvious one. What's a real obvious factor?
Likelihood of success,
Okay, which would be dependent on what, maybe?
your ability to swim.
Are you a good swimmer? Right? If my wife and I are on the beach and you know something about us and you're drowning, if you look up and see me coming after you, sorry, right? Something's gone drastically wrong. You want my wife, right? You don't want me. Yeah, can you swim well? Are you weak? Do you have training, right? All of these questions come into this. If you're a weak swimmer and a leg and an arm cast, because you're also a weak bike rider who took a heavy crash, right? Do you have the same obligation as somebody who's an incredibly good swimmer and presently robust and strong? You don't have the same responsibility, right? Here's a question. If this is true, so it changes your moral calculus about whether or not you should save this person depending on if you're a good swimmer or a bad swimmer, do you have a moral responsibility to become a good swimmer? Do you?
Well, I think you should all the time, but you can't do it in a matter of seconds.
Nope, you can't do it on the spot. So preparation, foresight, right? And if a good swimmer, then what else? Like, should we learn CPR? Should I become like a, search and rescue expert? Should I train a dog that it can help me pull people out of avalanches? Where does it stop, right? But the basic question is, if capacities change our moral calculus about the responsibilities that we can meet, do we have some sort, even if presently it'll go undescribed, do we have some sort of responsibility to develop our capacities?
Well, you should, but there's people that have children and don't even know how to take care of them.
Oh, I know. You're right. This guy had his hand up too.
So, essentially, last week when you said about the Spider-Man, power, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yes,
the
sir.
analogy here is that if we grow our capabilities, or if we grow our power, don't we have the moral responsibility to use it to save others?
So are you suggesting that maybe the Spider-Man ethic, who my dearly departed supervisor, right, a blessed memory, invoked all the time, is it possible that the Spider-Man ethic actually gets it backwards? So the Spider-Man ethic is with great power comes great responsibility. But maybe the moral rule should be something like, with great power comes great responsibility, or the ability to meet greater amounts of responsibility. And if you start to say it like that, does a nation, like people, have a responsibility to cultivate power and capacity? Yeah? That's interesting to me, because some of us have gone from a hesitance with power to now suggesting that maybe a good nation cultivates it. And there's got to be limits to that, right? Of course there are limits to that. But if people have that responsibility, maybe nations do too. I think that's interesting. This is going to get us into all sorts of choices. Military spending, right? Bombs versus bread is one of the catchphrases. I think our military budget is something like $800 billion maybe last year. It's lower than it's been. And this isn't directly analogous, but apparently we spend about $80 billion a year on sports, right? And apparently the entire sports industry is worth, and I don't know what that exactly means, but it sounds impressive, like $500 billion. So it seems to me we have actually lots of money that we can, so these binary choices, breads or bombs, are false choices, right? We're a wealthy nation. We have the ability to do a lot of good things. So how do we make these choices? All right, let's move on a little bit with the frustrating scenarios. What if you happen to recognize, so this question about who is this person drowning, what if you happen to know that the person drowning is, let's say, an Italian-American with bad eyesight, aching knees, an absent hairline, and somebody who finds running a sub-7-minute mile ridiculously painful?
What difference does all that make?
You tell me. Do you still have, so you're a strong swimmer, do you still have a moral obligation to save this guy?
Of course.
You say, of course. You say,
I mean, I'm mostly Italian, so I'm slightly biased.
paisano. There it is. All right, good. I just found out I'm apparently 61% Sicilian. So I didn't know it was that high. So a little bit goes a long way. My grandfather used to say, so sorry for the rest of you, but there are two kinds of people in the world. Do you know those two kinds of people? Those who are Italian and those who want to be Italian. Right? Come on. Get with it. All right. So it apparently makes no difference. Does anybody think we don't need to save this guy? Your hand is going up.
It's more of a
Go ahead.
follow-up question, which is to say that because none of those particular things seem to like I would think the sort of moral calculus question you might want to ask as relates to like this person's health and those kinds of issues would be, are they closer to death anyway than I am, and just in terms of like, not that you know everything, but just in all likelihood.
In
Now,
these
none of
incredibly
these
frustrating
specific
questions, let's ask that
things
one.
Seem to actually necessarily get at that.
Mhm.
You can live for a very long time with a receding hairline, right? But so maybe that becomes a trickier question.
Yeah.
If it's more something like, say, they just had a lung cancer diagnosis or something.
Okay, so
like
let's just go ahead and ask the awkward question that not you've now made the gorilla in the room, right? What if it's a Down syndrome boy?
Sure.
Right? Do we risk ourselves to save the Down syndrome boy?
Yes.
Is anybody getting angry at the question?
No.
Yeah, you should, right? A little bit.
No. Because
It should bother you.
There's been cases now when Down syndrome people have been doing more than what we've expected them to do.
And even if those cases didn't exist, do they have equal dignity?
Of course.
Right? Of course. Right? So now the Italian American doesn't matter. We still save him. The Down syndrome boy doesn't matter. What if he's a conservative Christian? Is that okay?
Sure.
Right? I get more snarky answers at the Naval Academy. Well, right? What if he's a Muslim?
Sure.
Anybody think we have no responsibility to save him? Okay, interesting, good. A Jew? Oh, your hand goes up. Turn the camera, George.
I had a question. I think the only criteria, if we're going to mess with the criteria
Right.
for the drowning person,
Yep.
I find the only one that's probably necessary are ones of, say, if they're overweight or something that affect the likelihood of your ability to the likelihood of your ability to save them. Right?
So-
If they're more difficult, if someone's overweight, you try to go in there and save them, and you're not a particularly strong swimmer, your risk factor of both of you drowning has also gone up. So it's not these kind of superficial character traits. It's things that are endemic to the situation and moral calculus in hand.
Okay, fine. So I'm going to stick a fork in all these questions because they're done, right? So the variables seem to matter on the part of the rescuer. The variables probably don't matter on the part of the drowning victim. Let me see if I can throw a wrench in that. You're walking along the beach. There are two people drowning. One is a total stranger, and one is your 5-year-old son. You have time and ability to rescue one. There's nobody else around. Who do you rescue?
Your son.
Yeah.
These two guys say, your son, and they nodded with confidence. Anybody think you rescue the stranger?
Your son's a brat,
Wow. All right. Okay, so
Maybe
this
this
is...
is mental gymnastics, but there's almost like if you're not considering the life of the two kids, but you are causing yourself the grief of losing your son, but if you don't save the other kid, then some other parent has lost their child. So maybe you're not
Yep.
thinking about the kids, but the other parent. But
Okay.
I'm not sure if that's too convoluted.
I
The
don't.
responsibility to your son.
If that's the answer to my question, it's not too convoluted. So let's just run with that. All right, let me pin you to it. So that's a charitable, self-sacrificial idea, right? Would you do it?
Probably not.
Probably not, right?
Make another son.
What's that? What was that? You can make another son? Well, I want those strangers to have the sheer joy of making another child, so I'm going to stand down. All right, what if it was your really smart dog and your neighbor's kind of stupid child? What about that?
Child.
Dog.
Dog should be replaced.
Who says you should rescue your smart dog? Wow. Is this Peter Singer or who is this guy? All right. He's laughing, so I think he's kidding. Maybe. All right.
Dogs should be good swimmers.
Dogs should be good swimmers. Good point.
Said he was
All right. All right. And then you can change the scenario in ways that affect the variable of the rescuer. Some of the ongoing questions that I ask the mids are things like you see the drowning stranger, the water is choppy, you're a weak swimmer, you're alone on the beach with your 5-year-old son. Right? So I begin to change the conditions of the rescuer. But what about the final 3 questions on this? And then we're gonna break them down a little bit more than we have. What if you know that the drowning person is actually an escaped convict in prison for petty theft? And you're trying to rescue him will be at least moderate risk to yourself.
Well,
do you think you have an obligation to try to save him?
I feel like this is just like saving someone who's Jewish or Muslim because it's the witness I'm giving to them. I'm risking my life for them, and it's the idea about I'm being a good witness to them. Perhaps he would turn his life around and be a better person instead of being a thief.
Good.
I mean, I think to any extent that we want to have some level of humility enshrined in our virtue system, being willing to let someone die out of our sense of moral superiority to them is probably going to be a problem.
I think like a lot of the questions we asked last week about like just war theory would kind of apply in this situation, in the sense that like you have to evaluate probability of success, but also like the moral hazard of it too, in the sense that like obviously in here you say petty theft, but if this was say like a convicted murderer, then I probably would say no, because maybe that was jumping to the next one, but because you have to evaluate.
Oh, that's right. You had the back. Oh.
Yeah, because you have to evaluate, like, obviously it's not an evaluation of my life is worth more than theirs, but it is a risk factor in terms of the success of saving that individual, not that they have less dignity.
Right. Yeah, their dignity question, what I hear is consistent, which is appropriate, is that the dignity question hasn't changed. But yeah, the next question is, what if you knew the drowning person was a homicidal lunatic attempting to cross the body of water to get to shore and to harm innocent people? All of a sudden she's shaking her head. Right? He's going to drown.
Then you might want to take the paddle.
You might take the paddle and help him out, right? So his dignity or her dignity hasn't changed, right? But the circumstances have changed. And maybe you simply say, because they're liable to be killed, I'm going to simply let them die because there's all these other people, right? So again, other circumstances have changed. So fine. All right, if you would turn to this part of this moral deliberation roadmap. The hypothesis is that in order to answer any of these questions, we've gone through at least 3, if not all 4 of these considerations. The first one you see is constraints, right? And I want to give this both a positive and a negative spin. And what I mean is this. Constraints are factors that limit the options we have in a moral conflict. Okay, so you can understand that it's a constraint. It limits you. But it limits you in 2 particular ways. They either require or forbid you from acting in a particular way. All right? And one of the big questions that are ongoing in philosophy and within just war ethics and things like this is, do human beings have positive duties, or do we only have negative duties? And so one of the negative duties might be, can't kill innocent people. Okay? That's a negative. You can't do something. All right? And if that's the rule, and if that's the absolute rule, then all sorts of other actions or inactions necessarily follow. You can't kill innocent people. Like, that's very specific, and that's also very broad, right? Can't kill innocent people. Rather than a positive rule that might say something like, protect innocent life. Right? Now I think you can see how all of a sudden a whole bunch of activities might be permitted in the second scenario, protect innocent life, that a moment ago might not have been allowable under the constraint, do not kill the innocent. Right? So what might be an example? If I say do not kill the innocent versus protect innocent life, if I say that second one, what actions that were previously forbidden under the negative rule might all of a sudden be allowable under the positive rule? Can you think of any?
I was reading a case about a terrorist leader who had taken an innocent woman as hostage and kept her with him so that they would shoot him because it would kill her too. But if not killing that terrorist leader means that millions, or maybe not millions, but a lot of other people would die, then the first don't kill innocent people would prevent you from trying to kill him because it would kill her as well.
Yep.
But the latter, protect innocent people, would maybe allow you to try to kill him, and she might be collateral damage to save the others.
Right. So now you begin introducing things like double effect. Double effect is this sometimes complicated way of trying to find a moral exception. I don't think it's an exception. I think it's an extension of the rule. But it's to say that, look, this idea about don't kill innocent people, maybe you got to start to fudge that. And you say don't intentionally kill innocent people. Once you throw that intentional word there. All of a sudden, that prohibition becomes a lot more open. Go ahead.
Like when I think about this question, I think about, say, like the jet planes in 9/11, for
Yes.
example, the one headed towards like the Capitol,
Right.
the White House. Like, should you shoot it down?
Mhm.
I would say yes,
Right.
because it's headed towards far more number of innocent people, and you have to take an actionable step to kill innocent people in order to save, a larger number.
Right. And does it work for me to say, okay, so I'm the president, you're the fighter pilot, I order you to shoot that plane down. Now somebody asks him the question, did you intend to kill those people?
Yes, in the sense that I knew my action was going to result in the death of people.
Okay, so you had a practical certainty that they would die.
Yes.
Was that your desire?
No.
Ah, that's interesting, right? What was your desire?
To protect innocent life, ultimately.
Mm-hmm. And to knock that plane down.
Yeah.
Like you desire to knock that plane down. If all the people parachuted out miraculously, just as the missile hit, would you think, oh, right? Maybe the terrorists, but not them. You would be good with that, right? So when somebody asks, and this is controversial, people yell at me all the time for this, but when somebody asks you, did you intend to kill those people? I think you can say, no, I intended to knock that plane out of the sky. I knew with a practical certainty that I was going to kill those people. That was not my intent. My intent was aimed here. And so there's different types of intention. There's different types of wanting. You wanted to stop the plane. But if you could have stopped the plane any other way, you would have, right?
The people would die anyway.
Well, and then you start to add complicating factors like that, right? And you just reconcile. But this, did you intend to kill that woman? No, you intended to stop the terrorist, right?
I have a question about the
Please.
framing of the language that
Yep.
we're talking about. In the Bible, in the Ten Commandments, a lot of it is "Thou shalt not
Yep.
kill." So, how do you reconcile this framing that God has given us of "Thou shalt not do this thing"
Right.
instead of "You should protect it"?
Such a great question. Glad you asked it. So first, the first answer, and this isn't a complete answer. The first thing is I think it's a bad translation, and I think the Hebrew agrees. It's not "thou shalt not kill," it's "thou shalt not murder," which all of a sudden brings this question of intention in. Okay, so that resolves a great amount of it, but it's still a negative prohibition. Thou shalt not murder. I think that takes care of a lot of the tension, but it's interesting, if you look under the Westminster Catechism, under their treatment of that command, under the sixth commandment, thou shalt not, I think they even say kill, all of a sudden they start describing it in positive ways. It's not just, killing a human being, it's slandering them, it's not, looking out for their welfare. All of a sudden, in order to meet this commandment, the Westminster Catechism, which is not scripture, but, it's does a pretty good job of what it's doing, all of a sudden prescribes all these positive requirements. And so I don't think you can talk about any of the 10 commandments that are negative without bringing in positive requirements as well. I know this in part because when Christ was asked, what's the summary of the law? He said, love your neighbor, right? What's that even mean? That's an incredibly capacious moral rule, and it goes back to the stuff we talked about last week. What does it mean to love your neighbor when your neighbor is kicking in the face of another neighbor unjustly and won't stop? Now, Christ told me I have to love him. But however I love the enemy neighbor can't be the same way that I love the victim neighbor in the same moment, but I have to love them both, right? And so all of a sudden, the positive laws that summarize all the law, all of a sudden require particular kinds of people. Like, we cannot be moral bureaucrats. And that's a part of what I think the Christian realist tradition embraces. Like, there is no moral bureaucracy. There is no simple, do not kill the innocent. Because, we haven't talked about ectopic pregnancies. Is that baby innocent? If anybody's innocent, that baby's innocent. But the mother's not going to live, and the baby's not going to live, and all of a sudden I've got to do something. And I can pretend I'm just targeting the fallopian tube. I need that pregnancy to end, right? And that sucks, right? But it might be the morally appropriate thing to do. But if you proscribe it by saying you can't kill innocent life, I also think it immediately becomes absurd because all of a sudden you're like, well, I'm sorry, wait a minute, what innocent life? Because by not stopping the pregnancy, an innocent life is going to be lost. To which some people might say, but you didn't take it, so you kept the commandment. And I begin to say, and I'm jumping the gun here because we're going to talk about character in a moment, but character matters. And so I'm going to actually hedge that for a moment and not go there yet. But this is the kind of conversation that I want to have. Okay, real quick.
Yeah, there was a case in Georgia where a woman, she's pregnant, she'd had other children, but they were telling her she needed cesarean section. She said, no, I'm praying and God's going to turn this baby around. And there was this case about they were trying to say we can take the child out of your custody while you're still carrying and all this, but she said, no, I'm going to pray. And she prayed and God did turn the baby around and she didn't need cesarean section.
Yep. It's got to be a place for the miraculous.
I mean, see, this was the mother's decision.
Yep.
I mean, what would be the mother's decision in this case? Does she want to have? Does she want to risk the child or whatever? I think that's her. It should be her decision.
Fair enough. All right, so constraints are both prohibitions and goads or spurs. They have to be both. Both positive and negative duties. All right, let's move quickly, and then we can open up. I want to finish this quick, and then we can open up to general Q&A. Constraints is the first question, right? So I've got this rule, right? Protect the innocent. And if before me is a simple question of I'm a great swimmer, and I can jump in the lake, and I can rescue the guy at very little risk to myself, it seems obvious. I don't need to consider any other factors. I jump in the lake, and I pull the dude out, right? Because it's a constraint. I'm morally bound to protect the innocent, right? But then consequences is the next thing you see. And all of a sudden, if the consequences of these actions begin to shift, maybe my approach to the constraint begins to shift. So the consequence asks the question, what comes of this? And it's a required question. If you see there, the way we frame it at the Academy is that these two considerations apply to all people. Whenever you consider an action, you have to think, what am I forced to do? What am I forbidden to do? And what are the consequences of doing either or not doing either? All right, our actions change lives, for better or for worse. We know this. Our actions change the world in small and large ways, for better or for worse. We know this. So both constraints and consequences have to come into play. We can never say something like, if by boiling a baby, some great good would magically happen for a great many people in the world, we should therefore boil babies. The consequences are great, right? So surely it's worth boiling one kid in order to bring about some miraculous great good for everybody, right? But we can't do that because we know about the prior constraint, right? And the constraints can overrule the consequences. And then we have to have complicated conversations about which constraints can be, fudged given what consequences, which is a part of the reason I'm writing a book on the bombing of Hiroshima, because there all of a sudden you get this in stark contrast. But I just want to get that out there. Certain things must never be done. Certain constraints must never be violated, no matter what the consequences are. On occasion, though, when the consequences are catastrophic enough, some will argue that constraints can be overruled. And I think this is Niebuhr. Right? Niebuhr says, no, the constraint is this. Don't resist evil, period. And then he looks over and he says, well, but of course, if we do that, then it's going to be like really bad, really fast for really everybody. So we can't do that. We got to overrule that, and we got to be responsible, right? But he's overruled a constraint rather than asking, how does that constraint apply in this situation? So Niebuhr would say to kill an enemy soldier is a violation of the law of love. A just warrior, I submit, would say, no, killing an enemy soldier is just what love looks like in the last resort. And that's god-awful and all of that, but it's not an exception, it's an application. All right? The third thing, and you'll notice that as we move down now, we're talking about morally permitted actions that apply, and these considerations apply to specific people. This idea of special obligations. These are obligations that are held by a person because of particular individual facts. All right? And this is apart from other factors, constraints and consequences that are incumbent on everybody. So what would be some examples of a special obligation?
So just that go back to the question of when you see the stranger drowning versus your child, I have a special obligation to my child because I have a unique and distinct obligation to my progeny.
You asked that as a question. I'm going to turn it around. Is it?
I think so.
You think so? Right? Why do you think so? Why do you think you have... Defend that to me. Why do you have some sort of special obligation to your child simply because you're its parent?
I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase it. I think it is a distinct moral duty. And I think, I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase it. Come back to me.
Okay. Somebody can help?
Moral obligation to radiate outwards from the closest to you onwards, so your neighbors are more, or you have an obligation to help your neighbors before someone on the other side of the country, and then you have an obligation to an American before you have an obligation to someone on the opposite side of the planet. You have an immediate obligation to yourself and your immediate family, and then your immediate neighbors before you have members to your larger community.
Does that sound complicated? I mean, it's simplistic. Not simplistic. It's simple in one sense, right? Like, and let me ask it this way: Is that moral? This is the word I want. Is that morally obvious? Like, does that just seem like moral? What's the word I want? Common sense, right? But does it get complicated quickly? Because you started to complicate it,
Yeah.
right? And then now all of a sudden you've got all these obligations. But while you're driving casually home, you see an automobile accident, and there's a stranger who needs your help, right? You promised your kid you'd be home in time to watch Batman together or whatever, but, and so, you have to do all this stuff that's morally intuitive. But now all of a sudden these special obligations take a back seat because it can here without a lot of harm. But in that scenario, to back seat my special obligation to my kid, right? And then you amplified it where I want you to amplify it in this kind of a conversation, because does the President of the United States have a special obligation to his or her own people over and against other people, right? And what are the limits to that? If it becomes a question, and this wasn't the question, but if it becomes a question of invading the island of Japan and suffering a lot of U.S. losses versus just nuking a couple cities and avoiding all that, is there grounds there to say, well, special obligations, right? What are the limits? What are the goads there, right? What do other people think about this idea of special obligations? Are we good with it? Isn't it selfish? Anybody? You look like is your hand? Yeah. No?
Okay, I wasn't sure if there's someone behind me. I mean, I think it can seem selfish on surface level because we do have emotional attachments to say to like your child. So if you're looking at it and saying like, oh, I'm only saving this person because I maybe like them better or have an emotional tie to them, I think we could maybe gaslight ourselves into thinking that you're doing it for the wrong reason. But if you actually have an obligation as a parent to your child, then that is important. And that's not really the reason why you're doing it. The emotions like come from that, but that's the reason.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good.
I think it also sort of ties into a recognition of limitations, and that we can't save everyone, and so we have to operate from some principle. And I think special obligations is the starting principle, recognizing that first and foremost, in a scenario where you recognize that all humans have dignity, but that you have to start, playing these hypotheticals where you have to pick people, you must have some sort of operating principle, and I think the special obligations principle is the best one you can operate with.
Yeah, great.
I was going to say it's not selfish because it applies to everyone equally, right? So instead of saying kids, because kids, some people have kids, but everyone has a mother, right?
Right.
You have an obligation to help your mother, let's think your grandmother in a nursing home, rather than some other old lady first because she's yours.
Right.
And that grandmother, that other old lady, well, if she has kids, then those kids' obligations for that woman. So it applies to everyone equally. It's just that you have your obligation to specific people.
Nice. Now, some midshipmen will always say that. I don't have any kids yet.
Yeah.
Right? My mother, and they always bring the mother in. So then we ask this question. So, okay, so now you're driving with your mother. Your mother's driving, you're the passenger. She's speeding. You have nowhere to go particularly, but she's speeding. She gets stopped by the police. The policeman comes over to the window, knocks it. Window goes down. She says, I'm sorry, officer, we're rushing to get to the hospital. My daughter's just been in an accident. You don't even have a sister. The policeman leans over and looks at you and says, son, is this true? Or daughter, lady, is this true? right? What do you say? What's that? You cover. I want to be his dog and his mother. Which is weird. That's a confession, I guess. That's kind of strange. Right?
Don't speak English.
Yeah. Right? So, go ahead.
I'd say it could be loving towards your mother to allow her to face the consequences for an imprudent action that could put people in
Right?
danger.
Right? Okay. So, you can start to play with what does, love for your mother look like. And maybe it means not letting her become the kind of person who lies to the police for no good reason. Right? Here are the qualifiers. I'm Italian. Right. Maybe you let her off the first time, but the second time she tries it, and you warn her afterward, like, Ma, never again. Like, never, you could fudge with all the details, but the point being, the special obligation remains, but even special obligations have side constraints and all of that, right? Great.
I was thinking about
Go
this
ahead.
a little bit differently when you
All
have
right.
a special obligation. Because see, a lot of times I see where people who have ability, so they
Nice.
might have special
Yes.
ability and they can help out and they don't. Like somebody who's a bodybuilder.
Right.
Could help save somebody who does not.
Right.
Okay. Medical knowledge, well, like this.
Yes.
I've been in situations too where we needed an interpreter and there was somebody there
Hmm?
who could.
Yeah,
and
great.
I just,
Perfect.
And I said, tell them where to go, and he acted like he didn't know. I mean, I would have rather him said to me, why are you asking me?
Mm-hmm.
And I could have said, because you speak Spanish.
Right. So now all of a sudden we've moved back to this question of should I develop my capacities? And if I do, I gather new responsibilities
Well,
or the ability to meet responsibilities that that need to be met.
in that case, I did because I knew who to ask.
Perfect. Right? Perfect. So, exactly. This is what I'm talking about. Other examples of special obligations to get them out, obviously family roles, oaths. Right? Certain among us have sworn an oath to do certain things. Right? Promises, gratitude. Right? Do we have a debt of gratitude for being born where we've been born? All the goods that have come from that. Is there a debt of gratitude that we owe our country simply by dint of being born here? Right? Does that impose a kind of obligation? All right, this last thing that I want to just get out is this idea of character. And on here, this says it applies to specific people. I want to excise that. That's the part of this that I think is actually flawed. I think this applies to everybody. Character is the disposition a person has to act in particular ways, to manifest particular virtues, to manifest particular vices. Honest people tend to act in particularly honest ways. Humble people in particularly humble ways, right? At the Academy, the Navy core values are honor, courage, commitment. We walk people through scenarios and we ask them, what does an honorable, courageous person do in a scenario like this? If these are the types of things that they do, go and do them, right? Because we want to habituate the mids into becoming men and women of honor, courage, and commitment. The assertion is simple. How we act now is habit forming, right? So that the little things we do, whether as a people or as individual persons or as a nation, habituates us into different things. So I gestured earlier to classical thought. Ethics in classical thought is connected to the idea of ethos, the disposition or the character of a person, a culture, or organization, the feel of it, right? The cultivation of virtue from classical to Hebraic thought has always been understood to be a very great thing. And I gestured towards some of the differences. In classical thought, arguably, the cultivation of virtues is its own chief good. In Hebraic, therefore Christian moral theory, we do good in order to help cultivate the virtues, but we cultivate the virtues in order to cultivate a taste for heaven, right? Because we are going to spend eternity exactly where we want to, right? And either we develop a taste for heaven or a disdain for it, right? And I think a lot of this is going to be predicated on whether or not we've become the kinds of people who exercise cupiditas or cupidity, right? Do we use self-centered acts of other donation, right? I make you sacrifice yourself for my own good, right? Or are we people that are characterized by charity? And charity is characterized by self-sacrifice, other-centered acts of self-donation, right? Where I have other people's goods in mind. It's not an effacement of the self, by the way. I have to have a self that's worth donating. So it's not as if I could be selfless. this distinction between cupidity and charity. I gestured, I think, last week to this being the difference between bellum, so as in the use in bellum, just war, versus duellum, duel. Duels are always forced used for private gain, right? And bellum can be force used, or ought to be force used for public gain. So war could be good or evil in the classical view. Duels could always only be evil, because it's always only self-centered value. All right, I'm going to bring this to a close. I wanted to walk us through this, and then, on your own, what you can do is you can look at the list of scenarios in the back and ask yourself, which of these moral deliberative resources did you use to answer these particular questions? And you'll find that they tend to overlap. To close, the purpose of Christian morality is beatitude. I've said this. It's human happiness. It's teleological. It's ends-oriented. We were created for specific purposes, right? That was to enjoy. Well, I should ask you the question, being good Christians. It's to enjoy God and know Him forever, right? That's a cultivated taste. I think in an analogous way, nations were created with certain vocations. You see it enumerated in Romans 12, but I think by extension you see it enumerated in what I am called to be as a human being is the same human being I am called to be, whether I am a school teacher or a parent or I'm working in the halls of government, right? I'm the same person with the same vocation, and therefore governments by extension have very similar vocations. All right. That's a way that I think a Christian realist can look at moral conflicts. We have time for questions, comments, frustrations, whatever.
Yeah, forgive me if you mentioned this last week when I wasn't here, but I'd love to hear a little bit about your own faith background, what denomination you maybe identify with, if you didn't identify with one, and then if you see any tensions specifically between sort of the Protestant just war theory, either was Protestant and Catholic.
Yeah, sure. Answer the question about denominations with a slightly snarky but actually sincere. I'm a terrible joiner. I hate joining things. I was raised quasi-Catholic. It didn't really take, not so much the Catholicism, just sort of the whole Christian thing in general. And I did touch on this, I think, a little bit last week. So I was a happy pagan for most of my life until sometime after college. Confronted with the problem of evil, so through the Holocaust, had no categories to hate Auschwitz, because I recognize that if there is no God, then reality is more or less subjective, or at least my response to reality is subjective. I found myself shaking my fist at Auschwitz and saying, "God damn this," and I actually really meant it. I was challenged through a book that kind of a prayer, or that kind of an imprecation is actually a prayer, that I actually meant it, like "God damn this." And that resonated, and I wanted to know how it could be that I could tell the difference between good and evil. And it wasn't satisfying to me that when I said Auschwitz is evil, I was only saying something about myself and not about Auschwitz. I wanted to be able to say Auschwitz was evil, and if you disagreed, to be able to say, no, you're wrong, actually, and that means something. So that led me into Christianity, but still, I went to whatever local church my friends went to. And again, I'm not a great denominationalist. I happen to go right now. I ended up deciding that I like Presbyterian churches because of the polity, right? It's organized, it looks like America, and it just makes sense because that polity handles human corruption and demands human responsibility, and I just liked all that, right? I still go to it's called Severn Run EP. We've been going there since I think probably November, so not long. And I don't remember saying this to him, but I was out of state at a lecture when my wife and kids. No, I was out of state with my son. So my wife and daughter went to this church on their own and came back, and she described the church. And I remember kind of being like, oh, this is interesting. So then I go to the church on Sunday. And then in between that Sunday and the next Sunday, we had a pizza party for all the cross-country kids. This is more information than you wanted, but here it is. And the pastor of the church, his daughter runs cross-country with my daughter, so the pastor of the church was there. And apparently the first thing I said to him is, "Hi, I'm Mark Levecki. I hate church." And he's a pastor, so he finds this awkward. But I immediately followed up with, for the first time in my life, I love going to church. And that's been my case since November. I actually like going to church. I've always hated church. Probably because it's full of people. And nothing personal, but I just like. And I don't know if it happens to be a Presbyterian church or if it is a Presbyterian church and therefore. But this guy takes Scripture seriously. He knows how to teach it. The people there are serious about being there, right? They give it the time. They give each other the time that's needed. So I just want a community of people that practice basic commitments to God and themselves, and I really don't care what denomination it is. I don't go in for that too much. If you want more of an answer to that really bad answer, I could probably come up with one. As to whether or not there's differences in Catholic versus Protestant just war thinking, I want to clean up one misconception. I don't think Reinhold Niebuhr is a just warrior. You ask other just war scholars, and they will say he is, so that's a point of controversy. But I think Reinhold Niebuhr, I think I said this last week, I said it to somebody last week, Reinhold Niebuhr is a pacifist who believes that you have to kill in order to be responsible in the world. And I think that major distinction disqualifies him from classical just war thought, which says that killing in war is not morally evil. Killing comes in different kinds. Some of it you never do. Murder, done. Don't do it. There are other kinds of killing that may be morally obligatory, or at least morally permitted, and it's not guilt-inducing. And I think that's a major distinction. One of the distinctions that a lot of Catholics, but not every Catholic, will have is that the starting point for just war is a presumption against war, and that as Christians we go through the world and we say, okay, the constraint is we don't go to war. And there's some degree where obviously that's true. We don't inaugurate new wars. Like Christians ought not to do that. Good nations ought not to do that. But the second way of looking at this is, well, wait a minute now, if that's the case, that we should not inaugurate new wars. But if a war has been inaugurated and it's unjust and we have to respond to it, then what tells us that the war is appropriate? Well, the need for justice to be requited. So the classical just war tradition, well, and I'm going to get into hot water because the Catholics will say ours is the classic tradition. Modern Catholic thought, by and large, will say a presumption against war, and I think, by and large, contemporary Protestant thought more rightly says just war carries a presumption against injustice, and that's the deciding factor. And that's to say that just war is by nature punitive. It only responds to an injustice and demands justice, which is the purpose of punishment. Right? So that I think is the major distinction between some branches. You'll find plenty of Protestants who say the same thing, and they cloak it under just peace. So as a branch of just warfare, they'll say, oh, no, it's just peace. But the conditions for which you can go to war are so limited that in practical terms you're a pacifist. So we have our equivalent. So I take it scholar by scholar. That's basically, I think one of the best just war scholars in America is George Weigel, who's one of the best Catholics in America.
Thank you.
Please. You.
Interested in what your take on Christian realism is and original sin.
Okay.
Original sin as Augustine talks about it and then reiterated by Calvin. You're born into sin, you're born with concupiscence that corrupts the will, prevents us from being able to save ourselves. One of the things that many advocates of the founders often say was brilliant about it was the separation of powers, preventing corruption of congregation of power and corrupt. So you were talking earlier about regimes that can cultivate both power and goodness.
Yeah.
Do you see some tension here with Christian realism? And can you just dive into this a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, what's the tension?
Well, the fact that if we cultivate power, right, that also cultivates our proclivity for maleficence.
Yep.
Right? So we're less likely to do, if we are Christian realists, then we believe that having power necessarily allows us to do evil.
Right.
And we won't necessarily do good because of our fallen nature.
Yep. So, what are all the prudential things that a good nation ought to do? We should have laws. Kings should not be above the laws. That's one. We should have moral frameworks like the just war tradition that we teach our military personnel so that they understand that there are sets of constraints that both forbid and demand certain types of actions. That should be taught all the way down to the lowest private so that they can hold their superiors accountable. We should then fortify those privates with shields like the demand that they disobey unlawful orders. And we don't prosecute them when they do. In fact, we prosecute them when they don't, right? So we build in self-constraints that we can usurp, that we can ignore, that we sometimes do, but they're there. And we have things that we can reference and say, no, we're not going to do that, right? And then we have elections so that people can oust people that need to be ousted. We don't always, right? Don't look at the last chunk of time, but whatever. And then where we can, and this it makes the bile rise in my mouth, but where you're able, make intelligent international coalitions where you allow other nations to hold you accountable, right? And that is it's not just a humility, right? It's a recognition that, look, like, as a human being, I'm arrogant and I need to be constrained, and I'm not going to like it. And I'm not going to like it if the United Nations tells me I can't do something. And maybe I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway, but we at least, we build these international coalitions, we have international treaties, and they provide the measure of constraints that we allow them to provide, but they're there. And we have at least documents that we can all point to and try to reinforce. And then you try to, if you're a citizen, there's a book that just came out by a guy named Phil Cly. I haven't read the book, just bought the book. But Phil Cly has written a good book of short stories called Redeployment, and then he wrote an excellent book called Missionaries about U.S. involvement in Colombia. But he just wrote a book called, I'm not going to remember the name, but it's about citizenship in the United States. And I've long argued that we have a professional military ethic that we teach our military. Here's how the profession ought to behave. And we have forgotten, by and large, unless you're an immigrant, that there is actually a professional civilian ethic as well in the United States. And that the oath, this was made, I think, recently famous by the basketball player. He ended up adding the word freedom to his last name.
And his cancer.
Okay. He filmed his citizenship, his oath of citizenship. And it's strikingly similar to the oath that officers take, right? To defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, all of this. And so built into that is a professional civilian ethic that is incumbent upon every one of us, whether we know it or not. We don't teach it, which is to our detriment. But I think one of the other ways that a good nation polices the fact that human beings marble original goodness and fallen nature, is by taking things like citizenship seriously and holding each other accountable. All the way down from, the lowliest parent in a neighborhood raising a good kid, and voting intelligently and wisely, all the way up to, the president and the Supreme Court and all of that, right? The Founding Fathers knew this, right? They said, this is yours as long as you can keep it. And good luck, right? Anybody else have a better answer to that question than mine? Because that's the question, right? Is, can any nation be trusted with power? The easy answer, and then you. The other easy answer is to say something like this, like in a acephalic world where there is no head, right? Somebody's going to lead, and right now, like, my honest to God question is, who would you prefer in the United States, right? And that doesn't answer your question, but if that says, okay, I prefer the United States, so the United States has to lead, we've got to figure out ways to be able to do that and constrain ourselves, right? I don't know, but
You basically summarized what I was going to say. It was a point you
sorry.
brought up last week, which was just that, like, in an anarchist system in which the world is, people are going to naturally rise to the top and seek power.
Right.
And would you not prefer a country like the U.S. or a country that has sort of these checks and balances and democracy to some extent seek that power?
Right. And another uncomfortable answer to that question, and maybe for some of you this is inspiring, to me it feels like a burden because I basically want to be left alone. That's like my goal in life. I want to be left alone, which is a horrible goal. So don't have that goal. But if you're a good person, like, seek positions of power, right? Seek positions in which power is expended, where paradigms are formed, and where people are formed, right? Because paradigm, powers, and people, those three things are vitally important to the success of any nation. And we need good people leading those endeavors rather than bad people, right? So that's a mandate. All right, what else? Any other, please?
I was
And
just
then you-
thinking earlier when you mentioned the Good Samaritan. Well, at church about 2 or 3 weeks ago, that the scripture read was the Good Samaritan.
Good.
And I mentioned to the minister afterwards how just the night before, I had read a news story on MSN about how just the opposite had happened. I think it was in Philadelphia, where
Yeah, right.
some young teenagers attacked a man and it killed him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So my question was, if they had known the story of the Good Samaritan, would they have done that?
Right.
I mean, this shows it's like our obligation to teach. If
Yep.
people are they being taught right, or will they do wrong?
Right. So this question about parenting again, right? I don't think we talked about C.S. Lewis and the necessity of chivalry last week. If we had another class, I would show you a Botticelli painting, which is about chivalry and the kind of warriors who fight just wars. And C.S. Lewis talks about the medieval code of chivalry, and he said chivalry was necessary because in order to, if only just warriors will fight just wars are not works of nature, they're works of art, which is to say they have to be formed, they have to be created, which means they're not accidents, which means we have a responsibility in raising our children in particular ways to morally form them. And so I can't answer whether or not, if we taught those kids the story of the Good Samaritan, they would have done something, but I would bet my hat that they would be more likely to do it, right? And that's probably the best we can do. So I try to raise just war kids, which sounds grim, but the world is grim, right? So it's okay.
So trying to take it a little bit more from the Plato's high-minded abstract back to the Aristotle's grounded. So
I like that move.
older Raphael. But when we try to think of Christian realism, actually in American foreign policy, where we talk about declarations of war, is it just do all this, but we're essentially living in a war where we have failed states in Latin America that our adversaries are taking advantage of, that they are basically funneling drugs, fentanyl especially, where you take one hit, you may be
Right.
hooked, or
Right.
you may completely die.
Right.
And they're sending that across our border, and we grapple with, are these real states? You know, we have the communist states of Cuba and Venezuela, where their people are literally calling for libertad, they're calling for liberty. And if we're going to say that they're our closest neighbors, like we talked about earlier, don't we have a responsibility to them to not only protect our own citizens, because we owe them that, but they're our nearby neighbors. Since the Monroe Doctrine of 200 years ago, do we have, in Christian realist thought, maybe not a casus belli, but at least some grounding to say, we need to go stop this, and maybe we need to be more confronting of that than we have been in our past? Does Christian realism fall under that?
So this Christian realist would say the very short answer is yes, right? And then this Christian realist would walk through like a moral framework like the just war tradition, and I would recognize sovereign authority because we have responsibility to our own citizens, and there are certain things that if they existed down there would be better for us. So then there's a just cause, and I'm actually trying to kick around a paper right now on whether or not this fentanyl question, I mean exactly that, is that a casus belli? Like who is sending it out of China, and what is their intent? And if their intent is a certain thing, then it's going to register somewhere on that just cause criteria, right? So I think you could walk yourself through right authority, just cause, proper intent, which is to suggest that maybe there is a cause for war, and then you have to bring in all the prudential criteria and say, okay, now, take a breath. What can we really do? What might come of what we do? On and on and on, right? But those would be the kinds of machinations that we would have to go through. But sure, I mean, there are certain things down there that ideally aren't happening. And they are. And yeah, we probably have some measure of responsibility to do something about it. And we might not be able to do anything. I doubt that's true. There's all sorts of things short of breaking things and killing people that we can do. So we should do those things. Right? And then I leave it to policy experts to figure out what those things are. Her and then you.
So in a society where where the norm is, and not just the norm, but like I'm gonna rephrase. How do you make the term like Christian realism, and I mean everything that it is, palatable to people who think that Christianity should have nothing to do with politics and we shouldn't bring religion into politics? Because I think these these arguments can be intuitive to people who aren't Christian. How do you not like remove the Christianity from it without, turning people away from it before they even hear it or something?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this isn't a dodge, but it's always going to depend on. Like, I wouldn't go testify to Congress and say, look, the Christian realist position is this, right? But I might say that to a friend over a beer and say, look, I'm a Christian realist. I think this. Both of these parts are important. And one tactic would be to say, okay, if you're bothered by the Christian realist, we can call it like good person realist or whatever you want to call it. But most people aren't pure realists. Like most people, there are some. But most people think, our interests should extend somewhere beyond ourselves. And once you start to admit something like that, then you're admitting there's some kind of moral realism. I think Krauthammer, blessed memory, called it democratic realism. So use whatever sort of qualifying term you want. But I think most people can begin to talk about like moral realism or something like this. Can you do better than me? Please.
Oh, I just wanted to posit a response maybe to the second part of your question, which might be to parry back to whoever might ask the question of what does faith have to do with politics, specifically Christianity. I'd say ultimately, from a Christian perspective, faith is a reflection of one's worldview, and so everyone has a worldview in some sort, regardless of whether they actually practice a particular faith, whether it's in particular Christianity or not. So I'd say ultimately everyone has a worldview operating, and that's a realist take, I'd say, And so fundamentally, there's no way to avoid, in a sense, an imposition of your worldview and how you consider how to approach real world problems. So that's how I respond.
Yeah, and that's certainly true. Everybody thinks about a situation from somewhere. Nobody thinks in a vacuum. And this idea of some sort of secular language, I don't think secular language exists, right? So it's just a question of how do we talk to each other. At the Naval Academy, I will often talk about what it means to be a good human being. There are some of the faculty and there are some of the students who don't believe there is such a thing as a good human being. Like, what are you talking about? There is no God. It's just sort of, some varying degree of up for grabs. But everybody does agree that there's such a thing as a good officer, which I find intriguing. So if you won't take me on good human, fine. Let's talk about what a good officer looks like. We're going to get to the same general point, right? So let's see if anybody else has a question, and then you can save yours for afterward. Oh, yeah, that's right. You're sitting there.
Yeah, so when
All right, last question, too, I think.
So when we talk about, just war theory, we spend a lot of time defining just and maybe a little less time defining war.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of asked that question, especially in the modern context, given what's going on in Ukraine, where there seems to be a lot of obviously there's varying opinions, but there seems to be a lot of consensus, at least among government officials and such at the moment, that we have some kind of, maybe even you might say, deep-seated obligation to send military equipment, money, maybe some other resources to Ukraine, and also, but also we couldn't even fathom the possibility, or we're so completely far away from actually sending any soldiers, any pilots, that direction. And so I guess, that's something where I think, on one hand, I sort of understand how you could come to that conclusion, but it does seem like there's a little bit of a dissonance there in terms of what we understand war and action and stuff to be in. So I'm just curious kind of how you define that, so that you come to kind of in such a way that might lead to very different or maybe more similar conclusions about that.
I mean, is the heart of the question, there's a set of things we ought to do in Ukraine, we're not doing them, and how do I reconcile that? Or
So it's more like what kind of framework would we use that leads to thinking very differently about sending one kind of resources versus sending another kind of resources?
So I don't know if this is answering your question, but I think the only thing up for grabs in Ukraine is the prudential criteria, so prudence. There are people that disagree, but if we could step in and end the war without threatening blowing up the world, there's a very large part of me that from the hip would say, yep, great, let's go in and do it. Done. Let's stop asking questions. But the fact that the world might be blown up actually has some like force, and we have to address that, right? And it gets more complicated from there. Like maybe it's not us, maybe it's NATO, all sorts of questions. But I think it's just a question of prudence. Like there's no doubt that there's cause. The innocents need to be protected, injustices need to be requited, wrongdoing needs to be punished, deterrence needs to be applied so that China doesn't think the West is a pushover. All sorts of reasons for doing something, and the block is prudence. Like it might not be wise to do that, and so then we try all sorts of other things that we can do short of threatening the destruction of life on Earth, and it's deeply dissatisfying. Good.
Thank you, Mark Levesque, and thanks to all of you for attending these 2 days of conversation about Christian realism, having resolved all the questions about this topic.
They're all done. Eric Patterson really exists, and we will get him back. Right? And then come.
Maybe. Thank you again. Good
Thank
night.
you.